It would probably take us many days and weeks to adequately cover the philosophical contributions of bell hooks. Right now, I have about 20 minutes. So I've divided this talk into two parts. One, a brief overview of her personal politics, and two, a brief overview of her public politics. First, full disclosure. About 40 years ago, I wrote my first book review ever, of her book called Ain't I a Woman? And I submitted it to a pretty prominent local leftist magazine, and they printed it, but in the course of printing it, we had a lot of struggle because the editor of the magazine had a big problem with my perspective on the book. I was totally opposed to it and everything that bell hooks had to say. As far as I saw, she trashed all of my heroes from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X, called them all a bunch of misogynists and patriarchs, and for a young black man, that was hard to take. Many of us on the left of the political spectrum first discovered the idea of the personal as political decades after the second wave feminism, which is generally thought to have begun in the 1950s. If the personal is political and politics are about power, feminists reminded us that feminism is, like public politics, intrinsically political. We also learned that what author Gerda Lerner wrote in her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, that patriarchy is a social system based on the subordination and or domination of almost all females and men and those who identify as such, to the rule of a relatively few men. Of course, many of us realize that females are often as tyrannical, violent, and murderous as men. On the other hand, men rape and kill much more often than women, whether at war or not, and especially domestically. Perhaps the most ubiquitous and continuous social oppression and low-grade warfare has always been against women. After all, even Frederick Engels wrote that women were the first slaves, often captured in actual warfare, while the men were killed. Nevertheless, it was only after I deeply reflected upon my own personal experiences, including several marriages and 50 years of political activism, and after assiduously reading Hooks's second book, Feminism from Margin to Center, several times over, did I really begin to understand what a real fundamental social revolution was. Hooks defines feminism as, quote, a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. All sexist thinking and action is the problem, whether those who perpetuate it are female or male, child or adult, unquote. One of Hooks's most important theoretical contributions is her political formulation of the principal global political enemies we face. And she breaks it down like this. Our enemies are imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy simultaneously. We'll get back to that formulation in a minute, but I want to right now pivot to Hooks's views on personal politics. Much of her writing, especially in the 21st century, deals with the meaning of love. In my opinion, Hooks's greatest contribution to that subject is the way she was able, like most great thinkers, to synthesize the most incisive and insightful thoughts of others on the matter. She cites, for instance, not only M. Scott Peck and the Buddha, but also thinkers as diverse as Che Guevara and Erich Fromm. From Peck, she learned that love, rather than being a feeling, is an action, what one does. It's also intentional. We choose to love. It's not an instinct. Hooks draws on Fromm's definition of love as, quote, the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth, unquote. Love as a noun or verb has presented many problems for men. We often invoke it, but a lot of us have never understood nor come to grips with it. Outside of the familial and romantic love, our motto seems to be, among liberals and leftists, what's love got to do with it? Well, Che told us years ago that we must be profoundly motivated by love. Beyond emotions, love is that mysterious power that, as Hook says, quote, allows us to go on, overcome disappointments, adversity, keep on pushing despite extraordinary circumstances. Of course, it's not hard to see, if we're paying attention, that so many people today see love as potentially flawed and fatal, or at best, a secondhand emotion. Many young people will tell you that one can have intimacy, that is sex, without love. And it appears that as long as they have a phone connected to social media, they prefer it that way. Maybe time will tell. Nevertheless, invoking the work of philosopher Thomas Merton, Hooks defines love as a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. Remember that old Dean Martin song? You always heard the one you love, the one you shouldn't hurt at all. In her book, All About Love, Hooks writes that love and abuse cannot coexist in healthy human relationships. I remember years ago, an ex told me that, I love you so much, Michael, I'll kill you. That's a lot of love, ain't it? Perhaps. Back to public politics. Hooks unequivocally agrees with Erich Fromm that the principles of capitalism are incompatible with love. Thus, the struggle against imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. Hooks understood, among other things, that imperialism, a term that's often used interchangeably with colonialism, means direct military conquests, that is, conquests of the New World in present-day Palestine. Or imperialism can mean indirect domination using native agents, what we see in Africa, India, many other places. White supremacy is the advocacy and practice of exploiting, dominating, and discriminating against people of color based on the myth of the superiority of people socially classified as whites. This is often conflated with white nationalism, and the two are related. However, white nationalism represents the objective, organized political expression of white supremacy, whereas the latter can be defined as personal bias. I remember the late Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael. He used to say, if a man hates me, that's his problem. Now, if he hates me and he has the power to kill me, that's my problem. It is critically important to understand what Hooks understood. One does not have to be classified as white to adhere to and uphold these views. A great example of that is Clarence Thomas. I remember the late Scalia once said that Thomas's views were so racist they made him cringe, and that's saying something, to make Scalia cringe. Here's a black man who's more racist than he is. So you don't have to be white to be that. And capitalism is a social system based on the rule of capital. Capital is money or anything else with a monetary value which, in the process of circulation, generates profit. A good example of that is the U.S. enslaved population. They represented not only commodities and credit, but their bodies represented capital of the highest order. It is said that when slave owners would go into debt, run up big gambling debts, and they couldn't pay it or didn't have the cash on them, they'd go sell a few of their enslaved people. Just like that. No worry about these people got families. I mean, you're selling the husband or maybe the wife and the children, but they were capital of the highest order. And patriarchy, we defined earlier, but it's important to remember that like the other toxic isms, one does not have to be a self-identifying male to uphold patriarchal rule. Some of Hooks's most riveting work details how sexist and misogynist and violent her mother was. In almost all of her books and interviews and public oratory, Hooks invoked the imperative to fight imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. If we think deeply about it, when we talk about the personal, also known as the private, we refer to bordered spaces and places that are socially created. But like so many phenomenon, those borders are porous, so porous that the line between the personal and the public is untenable. There are no natural social boundaries. Unlike natural boundaries, they must be constantly negotiated. An example of this is domestic violence, once thought to be a totally private, personal matter. This violence is now seen as a very serious public matter. By the way, Wikipedia, that great public dictionary online service, defines the public as a population of individuals in association with some matter of common interests. The commons. According to Cyclopedia.com, this is a quote, women have been associated with the private sphere and with private spaces, such as the home. Women have been described as naturally more emotional and self-interested than men, as well as more fragile. Based on this understanding of women, it has seemed appropriate that women remain in the private sphere, while their perceived fragility can be protected and their irrationality can be removed from the discursive public. This view is, of course, false, but it has nevertheless shaped societies globally, unquote. And that's putting it lightly. Bell would tell us that we live in cultures of domination, in which the distribution of power involves, among other things, power over something or person, or under something or person, instead of sharing power, that is, power with. I think we've seen enough evidence of how power corrupts and absolute power, for instance, the power of the current Supreme Court and the power that they gave U.S. presidents corrupts absolutely. Hook says, quote, cultures of domination rely on the cultivation of fear as a way to ensure obedience. We are all terribly afraid most of the time. As a culture, we are obsessed with the notion of safety. But we do not question why we live in states of extreme anxiety and dread. Fear is the primary force upholding systems of domination. It promotes the desire for separation. This is Hooks talking. When we are taught that safety lies in sameness, then difference of any kind will appear as a threat. When we choose to love, we choose to move against fear, against alienation and separation, unquote. In my conclusion, I'd like to offer a few more brief pearls or gems of wisdom from the extensive body of work of Bell Hooks. All of these are quotes. You can't get any more radical than Jesus. The heart of democracy is loving justice. Feminists are made, not born. If women do not have the right to choose what happens to our bodies, we risk relinquishing rights in all other areas of our lives. Hear that, Mr. J.D. Vance? Radical, visionary feminism encourages all of us to courageously examine our lives from the standpoint of gender, race, class, so that we can accurately understand our position within the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Thank you.